In the spring of 1945, as the guns fell silent across Europe, a strange and uncomfortable truth began to spread through the American countryside. Thousands of German soldiers, men who had once marched beneath the swastika, who had sworn loyalty to Adolf Hitler, who had fired their rifles at Americans in Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy, were refusing to celebrate the end of the war. They were afraid, not of punishment, not of execution, but of going home. This is the story of the German prisoners of war who did not want to leave the United States, men who had expected chains and cruelty, and instead found warm bread, baseball games, and something far more dangerous to a totalitarian mind, freedom. They had expected hell, but what they found felt, at times, like paradise. By 1942, the war had turned against Germany. In North Africa, General Feldmarshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had been pushed back by British and American forces. In May 1943, at the surrender in Tunisia, nearly 250,000 Axis troops were captured. Among them were tens of thousands of Germans. The United States faced a problem. Britain was already overcrowded with prisoners. Shipping them back to North Africa was impossible. So Washington made a bold decision: transport the prisoners across the Atlantic to camps inside the continental United States. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and the right to correspondence. The United States had signed and ratified it. Washington intended to follow it to the letter. Between 1942 and 1945, over 400,000 German prisoners were transported to America. They arrived in waves, under heavy guard, stepping off ships at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, and New York Harbor. Many believed they were being sent to their deaths. Propaganda had told them that Americans were savage capitalists, that they lynched prisoners, that they tortured enemies in secret camps. Some had been warned by SS officers: the Americans will starve you. They will break you. As the first transport ships docked, prisoners peered through barbed wire and watched the skyline of American cities rise before them. One young private from Bavaria reportedly whispered to the man beside him, "If they shoot us, it will be quick." Instead, they were handed cigarettes. They were processed, examined by doctors, given hot meals, and assigned to camps scattered across the American landscape, from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to New York State. The camps themselves were often built to mirror American Army barracks: wooden huts, clean bunks, central heating in colder regions, recreation areas, even small libraries. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners were stunned to find they could walk between barracks without chains. At Camp Algona in Iowa, they were served food that, in many cases, was better than what American civilians could buy under rationing. A captured corporal once wrote in a letter home, "We eat white bread every day. There is meat, sometimes even cake. I do not understand this country." They did not understand it because it contradicted everything they had been taught. The rations were not charity. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to receive food comparable to that of the detaining power's own troops. And American authorities, conscious that American POWs were in German hands, adhered strictly to the rules. But to young men who had endured shortages and bombings back home, it felt surreal. They were enemies, and yet they were being treated with dignity. By 1943, labor shortages began to plague the American economy. Millions of American men were overseas. Farms lacked workers. Factories struggled to maintain output. The solution was controversial but practical: employ German POWs as laborers. Under international law, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, though not in dangerous or war-related industries. Officers were exempt, and so the spectacle began. German soldiers in faded field gray uniforms could be seen picking cotton in Mississippi, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, cutting timber in Wisconsin forests, and packing vegetables in California fields. At first, local Americans were wary. A farmer in Kansas reportedly muttered, "I lost a boy at Anzio. Now I'm supposed to trust these krauts with my crops." But necessity overcame anger. The prisoners worked hard. Many had grown up on farms. They followed orders. They did not sabotage machinery. And as weeks turned into months, something unexpected occurred. Conversations began. Broken English met hesitant German. Gestures turned into shared jokes. A glass of lemonade on a hot afternoon became an offering not of politics, but of humanity. One farmer's wife in Nebraska later recalled, "They were boys. Just boys. Like ours." For the prisoners, the shock deepened. They had expected hatred. Instead, they encountered something else entirely. There were tensions within the camps. Among the prisoners were committed Nazis, true believers who enforced ideological discipline. They formed secret courts. They intimidated or assaulted fellow prisoners, suspected of being disloyal. In several camps, anti-Nazi prisoners were beaten or even murdered by fellow Germans. The U.S. Army struggled to separate extremists from moderates. But even here, cracks formed. Access to uncensored American newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films began to undermine Nazi narratives. Prisoners watched newsreels of Allied advances. They saw images of bombed German cities. They heard speeches by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, one prisoner reportedly stood in silence after hearing of the D-Day landings. "It is over," he said quietly. "Germany cannot win this." Others resisted the truth. "It is American lies," an ardent Nazi snapped. "The Fuhrer has secret weapons." But doubt had entered the barracks. The American policy evolved into something more ambitious than simple detention. It became re-education. By 1944, the U.S. military began identifying cooperative prisoners and moving them into special programs. They were given books banned in Germany. They were encouraged to discuss democracy, constitutional law, and freedom of speech. In one camp, a group of prisoners staged a performance of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. For many, it was their first exposure to literature outside the rigid ideological confines of the Third Reich. A young sergeant from Hamburg wrote in his diary, "They let us read whatever we wish. No one checks the pages. No one listens at the door." For men who had grown up under surveillance, the absence of fear was disorienting. Letters home became lifelines. Under Geneva rules, prisoners could correspond with family, though censorship applied. Many wrote cautiously positive descriptions. "We are treated well." One wrote, "Do not worry for me." Some went further. "If this is the enemy," another mused in a letter intercepted by censors, "then we have been deceived." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across American cities, crowds celebrated. Flags waved. Church bells rang. Inside the camps, silence prevailed. Some prisoners cheered quietly. Others wept. A few stared at the ground. They knew what awaited them. Germany lay in ruins. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden had been shattered by bombing. Millions were displaced. Food was scarce. The Nazi government had collapsed. The future was uncertain. Rumors spread rapidly. The Russians are taking revenge. There's no work. There's no bread. American guards began receiving unexpected questions. When will we leave? And then, more quietly, must we leave? In camps across the Midwest and South, prisoners approached commanding officers with hesitant requests. Could they remain as workers? Could they apply for visas? Could they start anew? The answer at first was no. International law required repatriation after the cessation of hostilities. The United States had pledged to return prisoners promptly. Trains began to move. Ships were prepared. But the mood in the camps grew heavy. One guard in Texas later recalled a prisoner saying, "Sergeant, I never believed your country was like this. If I return to rubble. Here I have work. I have bread." By late 1945 and into 1946, the repatriation process accelerated. Many prisoners were first transferred to Britain or France for labor duty before being sent back to Germany. Tears were not uncommon. Farmers who had worked alongside German prisoners for years shook their hands at departure. "Take care of yourself," one American told a former enemy. "Maybe we'll meet again in better times." Some did meet again. In the decades that followed, former POWs applied for immigration visas. The United States had quotas and restrictions, but over time, thousands returned, this time legally. They became citizens. They opened businesses. They married American women they had once met through barbed wire fences. One former prisoner settled in Wisconsin and became a respected member of his community. When asked years later why he returned, he answered simply, "Because here, I learned what freedom felt like." The irony was profound. The United States had not set out to win hearts inside its prison camps. It had intended to follow international law and maintain moral high ground. Yet the effect was transformative. German prisoners who had been raised on propaganda witnessed a functioning democracy. They saw newspapers criticize the president without fear. They observed racial tensions and political arguments, yes, but they also saw open debate, elections, churches of many denominations, and citizens who spoke their minds. Some returned to Germany carrying those memories. In the ruins of post-war West Germany, where a new democratic government would eventually rise, former POWs became part of Reconstruction. They had seen an alternative. They had lived among former enemies, who had chosen restraint over revenge. It did not erase the crimes of the Nazi regime. It did not absolve guilt, but it complicated hatred. The story of the German POWs, who did not want to leave America, is not a tale of softness in war. It is a testament to the power of adherence to principle. While battles raged in Normandy and the Pacific, while cities burned and armies clashed, a quieter battle unfolded behind barbed wire in the American heartland. A battle between ideology and experience, between propaganda and reality, between fear and dignity. In 1945, as ships carried German prisoners back across the Atlantic, many stood on deck and looked westward, toward a country they had once been told to despise. Some saluted, not in the rigid fashion of the fallen Reich, but with a quiet nod of respect. They had come as enemies. They left changed men, and in that transformation lay one of the most unexpected victories of the Second World War.